Today is Friday and October 11th, and we're having Ambassador Freeman with us to talk about the conflicts in the Middle East and in Ukraine.
Glad to be with you. Nice to see you again, Nima.
My pleasure, as always. And let's get started with what's going on with UNIFIL and the way that they have been attacked by Israelis. And it seems that each and everybody right now, France, Spain, Italy, and they're talking about this attack. What's your take on that?
Well, UNIFIL, which was established to maintain peace along the border between Israel and Lebanon, obviously has been overtaken by events. There is no peace there. Israel has no desire for a peace there. It is, in fact, in the process of trying to turn southern Lebanon into the equivalent of Gaza. That is, leveling the buildings, forcing the population out. And it evidently has plans to settle the area eventually with Israeli settlers. So this is a war of expansion. Israel constantly declares that it has a right to defend itself, but it is not defending itself. It is conducting a war of extermination in Gaza. It is mounting a similar effort at a lower level of intensity in the West Bank, the occupied territories, and it is now conducting a similar campaign against a neighboring state, Lebanon. And of course, earlier I should mention, Israel was a full participant in the international, largely American effort to vivisect Syria, to tear it apart, and it remains broken. Israel is striving for overall supremacy in West Asia, and there's a grave danger that having eliminated various movements like Hamas, or having crippled Hezbollah, another movement which turned to Iran for support, it will now go after Iran directly, as Mr. Netanyahu has always wanted to do. I think the obstacle there is the uncertainties surrounding American participation in any attack on Iran. And there's also a factor here of the American elections, because if the attack were to take place and the United States were to do nothing for Israel, which would be my recommendation, since I don't believe aggression should be rewarded, then this would probably result in the election of President Trump again, which is something that Iran does not want, but Israel does. So this is very complicated, and it's very uncertain what is happening. And UNIFIL is simply an awkward presence caught in the crossfire. I think there have been 4 UNIFIL soldiers, Irish soldiers, wounded by Israel. They're deliberately targeting UNIFIL. They want it gone. They're trying to treat it the same way that they treated UNRWA, the aid agency for Palestinian refugees. So this is what is happening there, as far as I understand it. You're muted.
Here is the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett is talking about what they're seeking for with this conflict in Iran, with Iran.
Thank you so much for joining us here on the program. The world is waiting and watching to see how Israel responds to Iran's ballistic missile strike on Israel last week. What do you think they should do?
I believe that Israel should strike Iran's nuclear program and strike regime centers. And I'll explain why. The ultimate strategy that I believe that the world should have is to not allow to Iran acquire a nuclear weapon ever. And how do you do it? By accelerating the toppling of the regime, it will fall, and ensuring that in the meantime they don't acquire a nuclear weapon. So basically you need 2 efforts: to accelerate the toppling of the regime and to slow down the acquisition of nuclear weapons.
Does Israel have the capability, though, to do it alone?
Yes. We can strike and cause considerable damage, I don't know if we can destroy the whole program, but as I said, we have to delay it while we accelerate the pace of the toppling of the regime.
When you say...
Yeah. He wants to topple the regime in Iran.
Well, this is consistent with previous Israeli efforts to topple regimes in the area, and it is very aggressive. I would say two things, however. The first is that these threats are actually, for the first time, producing an open debate in Iran about acquiring nuclear weapons and using them as a deterrent against Israel. So far from scaring Iranians into abandoning their nuclear program, this is strengthening the voices of those who call for a reversal of the fatwa by which the Ayatollah Khomeini declared weapons of mass destruction to be forbidden, haram, in Islam. So there have been 40 members of the Iranian parliament, I understand, who have written an open letter to the authorities, arguing that Iran must now go nuclear. We have not seen this before. As you know, the intelligence agencies, both Mossad in Israel and CIA in the United States, MI6 in Britain, all have concluded that Iran has not made a decision to build a nuclear weapon. I think we are coming now very close to such a decision. And I think it is foolish to imagine that an attack on Iranian nuclear facilities would eliminate any Iranian capacity to build a bomb. I think the knowledge to build a bomb is now well established in the brains of Iranian scientists and engineers, and they will do it. Israel would pay a terrible price, not necessarily immediately, but in the longer run, were Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. And second, I think the history of regime change is very unfavorable to Israel. You look at efforts to change regimes, and what you usually find is the next regime is worse than the one you overthrew. So, and finally, in Iran, all of these threats of war and so on are actually aiding the regime, gaining support for it. Iranian nationalists, Persian nationalists who were previously dubious about the theological regime of the Islamic Republic are now rallying behind it. And, because in the end, whether they are committed to the current Walayat al-Faqih version of Islam that Iranian clerics espouse or not, they are Iranians and they are nationalists and they want to defend their country. So I think this is a case of extreme hubris, overweening pride, and very likely overreach by Israel. And I guess I should also note that Naftali Bennett does not have a great deal of company when he says Iran can do it on its own, and that is not the Israeli strategy. And I believe that one reason for the delay is that President Biden has, although he has not grown a backbone, he is still very weak in relation to Israel and has been humiliated repeatedly by Netanyahu. He is apparently angry enough now to have told Netanyahu, no, you should not strike the nuclear facilities. You should not strike the oil refineries, which are the alternative target. And all of this, I guess, there's another factor here, and that is the Iranian missile attack on Israel on October 1 in reprisal, in retaliation for a whole series of provocations by the Israelis, which Iran had delayed responding to. This was a very restrained action by Iran. An attack on Iran by Israel will remove the restraints. And what Iran showed on October 1, as it showed in April, is that it has weapons that can penetrate Israeli and American defenses of Israel and get through to their targets. Israel has been very cautious about whether or not F-35s were actually destroyed by the October 1 attack. But there's more and more evidence that they were. So this is not the simple matter that Mr. Bennett imagines. Quite aside from the fact that the world would roundly condemn this would add to the isolation of Israel internationally. Nobody would favor it any more than the world favors slaughtering peacekeepers from the United Nations in Lebanon.
Yeah, it seems that in Washington they're talking about that Israel is not sharing the details of what they're planning to do with Iran, and how we can understand it, because without the United States they're not capable of doing this, and they're not eager to share anything with the United States.
Well, the fact that they're not sharing information, if that is true, and of course it is not necessarily true, it may be a deception, but by the United States, because there are people in the United States, including many in the administration, who favor an attack on Iran. There are members of the United States Senate who are vocal on that subject. So you cannot take anything the United States says for granted on this as being true. So that is a caution. But the fact that Israel is, let's say it is not in fact sharing information, that means it has no agreement with the United States on what the United States would do. And therefore, this would be, if Israel does attack Iran, it would probably try to do so in such a way that it calculated the United States had no alternative but to support it. And that means before the November 5 elections, for the reason I mentioned. So I'm not sure that's good news, that there is no information exchange. What it means is Israel will pull a trick. There's a long history of this, and people forget. Before the United States became absolutely subservient to Israel and declined to criticize it, there was a long history of American condemnation of Israeli terrorism. I think President Truman, when he recognized the state of Israel, was absolutely appalled and declared he was at the Nakba, at the handling of Palestinians and their expulsion from Israel. That is not what he expected when he recognized Israel. In 1953, Ariel Sharon, later the prime minister of Israel, but then a junior officer in the Israeli military, was condemned by the United States for the massacre of a village in the West Bank. In 1956, Israel attacked a false flag operation against the American libraries, one in Cairo and one somewhere else, which they claimed was done by Muslim extremists, but it was in fact done by Israel, and the United States condemned them for that. The United States joined against them in the United Nations when they attacked at Suez, the Suez War of 1956, and so forth and so on. And you can go right up to the USS Liberty, an American espionage or eavesdropping ship off the coast of Israel, which the Israelis sunk and where they killed many of the sailors. This was covered up by Lyndon Johnson. It's not been acknowledged yet, but the facts are very clear. So Israel has a long history of trying to entrap the United States in wars. It did that in 1967, again, with its surprise attack on Egypt and Syria, which resulted also in a war with Jordan, and it cost the Palestinians their control of the West Bank and Gaza. So you can't rule that out. I mean, that would actually be consistent with previous Israeli behavior, and I think we should be worried.
Yeah. As you mentioned, if something big happens in the Middle East in terms of Israel and Iran and maybe to Gazans in Lebanon, that would directly affect the result of the 2024 presidential election in the United States. That would favor Donald Trump. And do you think that the Biden administration is considering this, or the Zionists are so much powerful right now within the administration that they don't even care what would happen to the party.
Well, I don't think the Zionists really do care very much about what happens to an outgoing administration, which is already a lame duck administration. So I don't think that is a factor. But I believe the administration does understand the political risks and the pressures that Israel may be under to act sooner rather than later. And I think the phone call that President Biden had with Prime Minister Netanyahu must have been rather unpleasant, despite the fact that Mr. Biden is himself a self-declared Zionist, wishes the state of Israel well, and basically has been supportive of Israel. But I don't think he's supportive of this idea. And I think he is concerned. And I know that the Defense Department is concerned.
Yeah. Here is an article that shows the aid from the United States to Israel, more than $22 billion to Israel. And in this second slide, you see that it goes to $17.9 billion just directly to Israel. Putting together with those costs from the presence of the United States in the Red Sea and other operations, it would be more than $22 billion. And at the same time, you see when the journalists are asking Matt Miller about
taxpayer,
the way that they can put pressure on Israelis, here comes the answer that Matt Miller gave to the press when they ask about it.
We've given them, or taxpayers paid for, almost $23 billion in the last year alone. That's almost $3,000 for each and every Israeli. So you have absolutely no leverage on, no pressure. You cannot tell them do this or not do this.
So we make very clear to the government of Israel what we believe that are the best outcomes along a number of different vectors in the region. But as you've heard me say before, they're ultimately a sovereign country and have to make their own decisions.
Yes, but I understand. But a sovereign country that received from American taxpayers that received $22 billion.
So first of all, that number is not
okay.
correct.
Yeah.
That man is such a blatant liar that it is really disgraceful to hear him. That number is correct, almost 23 billion. It's probably conservative, as I believe the Watson Institute at Brown declared. And it is rock solid as a number, the lowest number. But the notion that somehow or other a sovereign nation is immune from diplomacy or American foreign policy, or that the wishes of the United States cannot be forcefully expressed to that government, is absolute nonsense. We do this all over the world to every other country. And I know that we condemn countries, as we used to condemn Israel, I mentioned in the 1950s. We condemn countries for conducting terrorism, which Israel is clearly doing, and we deny the transfer of arms to them. We have laws on the books, the Leahy Law, which prohibits the transfer of arms to any country that is doing what Israel is doing. So this is a gross cover-up, and it is mendacious, and it is terribly damaging to American credibility around the world. Because if you have power and you declare what you want and you don't use your power is devalued, not just with respect to Israel, but with respect to every other country. So this is a weakening of the United States internationally and a discredit to our government, which used to tell the truth, but now apparently finds it very difficult to do so.
Has Israel been successful in isolating the new government, the new president of Iran?
No, I don't think so. Although I think the reaction of some European countries is disappointing. After all, the new president of Iran has been very clear that he wants to reach out to the West. and especially to Europe. He actually wanted to restore the nuclear deal, which Naftali Bennett doesn't give any credence to. So far, Iran has not developed a nuclear weapon. As I said earlier, it's now under increasing domestic pressure to do so. How this could be in anyone's interest, I do not understand.
Yeah, as we talk, we know that Iranian president and Putin they met and talked to each other. And here is the statements by Putin and the president of Iran. The main points of this: Putin said that relations with Iran are a priority for Russia, and they are developing very successfully. Another meeting with the president of Iran is planned at the BRICS summit in Kazan. And the third point is Russia is actively cooperating with Iran on international stage. And the points of the president of Iran were that the situation in the region has become critical due to Israel's disregard for international and humanitarian legal norms. European countries and the United States hinder de-escalation in the Middle East. The partnership between Iran and Russia in the cultural and economic aspects is strengthening daily. And Iran expects to sign a strategic cooperation agreement between the countries, Iran and Russia, at the BRICS summit in Kazan. And here is the question for the United States, for the policymakers in the United States: the way that they're trying to just repel Iran and Russia, do they really have any sort of strategy when it comes to Ukraine and right now in the Middle East? Because the way that they're pushing them, they're trying to ignore them, it doesn't seem to work for the United States.
Well, we have no strategy for either Russia or West Asia, Iran, or for that matter, in Pacific Asia. We have an attitude, we have programs, we have statements. We do not have a dialogue with any of these countries. There is no effective diplomacy being undertaken by the United States with respect to any country in West Asia at the moment, including Israel, by the way, which treats American requests and desires with contempt. We have no dialogue with Iran. I'm glad you mentioned the Kazan BRICS meeting, because that is also a factor in the timing that should be considered. Probably it is not being considered by Israel. But if Israel attacks Iran as the Kazan meeting is about to take place or has just taken place, which is in about, 10 days, I think, 11, 12 days, this could well bring together a coalition against Israel that is outside the UN context, cannot be vetoed by the United States. I think it is becoming more and more apparent to the world that the United Nations, like the League of Nations, has outlived its usefulness. The League of Nations ended as a result of a world war. We must hope that the UN does not require a world war to produce reform and reshaping of its institutions. But the fact is that if the UN cannot be used to enforce international norms, then it is open to countries to organize themselves in a different format, perhaps an ad hoc conference, maybe like the Kazan BRICS meeting, at which they could adopt policies, common policies, to deal with the threat that Israel now poses, not just to the region, but to world peace, and to deal with the gross injustices that Israel is inflicting on the people under its control, Palestinians and now Lebanese. So I think this is something that should be considered by Israel and Washington, because the Kazan meeting might very well take on a whole new character if it is combined with Israel's expansion of its expanding regional war to Iran.
Yeah. And when it comes to the Middle East, the countries, these Arab states together with Turkey, here is the picture that shows Smotrich in this picture shows the bigger map of Israel, and in which you see that they're considering Jordan, they're considering Saudi Arabia, Palestine, part of Syria. They're considering all of these countries. Even I saw a video that in which he's describing even Iraq, even goes beyond the borders, and they're
Yeah,
considering part of the bigger Israel, the plan that the expansion plan that they're having in their mind. In your opinion, right now, in in the mind of Arab states, do they really consider it as a problem of Palestinians, or they just feel the threat coming from Israel? Because if they feel that, they would come with some sort of pressure, even on the United States, on Israelis, that would make a peace deal in Lebanon, in Palestine, even much easier. And
Mr. Smotrich is in a video from 2016 in which he includes part of Egypt to the shore of the Nile River, Iraq, and all of Lebanon, which is not in that map that you just showed. And he talks about taking Damascus, and he talks about taking part of northern Saudi Arabia and all of Jordan. So it's very clear that his particular school of religious Zionism is heavily expansionist beyond the immediate Palestinian region, and to include all of Israel's neighbors and a threat to them. But nobody has taken this seriously in the region until now. I think the assault on Lebanon, together with the effort to force the removal of the entire population from northern Gaza and to resettle it, there are boat trips being organized to go up and look at beachfront property in Gaza for settlements. There are similar plans for southern Lebanon. So I think it is no longer possible when Israel is driving for military supremacy in the entire region, including the defeat and regime change in Iran, to ignore this kind of fanatic attitude. Whether it should be taken really seriously or not is another thing. But it represents a kind of hubris and a kind of ambition that is very unreasonable, threatening, and has to be taken into account. And it comes from a man who is busily wrecking the Israeli economy, even as he and his fellow religious Zionist, Ben Gvir, try to complete the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank.
yeah, how about Turkey right now? How do you find Erdogan? He was just getting much more solid in his talk toward Israel. But what does it mean when it comes to what he's able to do?
It's not clear what it means. Many people have written it off as cheap talk, and maybe that is all it is. I mean, it's to the advantage of Turkey, which has basically been given the cold shoulder by Europe, even though it remains a member of NATO, and which is now looking to Russia and to the Middle East, to its south, to West Asia, and to Africa as its focus for its sphere of influence and good relations. It is very advantageous to Mr. Erdogan to talk tough about the Palestinians. But when it comes down to, when you look at it in the end, the striking thing about what has happened is that the entire Muslim world, despite grave concern about what is being done at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, what is being done to Muslims in Palestine, and now in Lebanon, and possibly to Iran, as well as in Yemen, and it was done in Syria, does nothing. They talk and they do nothing. And this is true of the Gulf Arab countries, who, are practicing realpolitik vis-a-vis Israel don't want to break with the United States. And therefore, while the publics in these countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, the publics are furious about what is happening in Gaza and in Lebanon. The governments, the rulers, do nothing. And so is Mr. Erdogan the exception, or is he part of a common pattern? How seriously should Israel take his threats? Apparently, they don't take them very seriously. And the fact that he is patching things up with Egypt is, potentially important in a strategic sense, in that Egypt is squirming in the embrace of the Camp David Accords now. But I'm not holding my breath to see Mr. Erdogan actually do anything.
Yeah. There is a documentary by Al Jazeera about what has happened to Gaza after 1 year. And it shows how the mainstream media help Israelis during this process of destroying Gaza.
Right.
And do you, right now, in your opinion, how we can understand the behavior of mainstream media, and why have they decided to help Israel the way that they did? Because with CNN, they're trying to just play both sides, as sometimes you feel that. But how about the mainstream media in totality? What's your take on what they've done during this?
Well, they're very pro-Zionist. They have been for a long time. They self-censor. They don't report Israeli atrocities. There have been many of those over the years, not just in recent months. And they don't want to report those. Why? Because it doesn't help them earn advertising revenue. They will be attacked if they put on that news. This is why in the United States, the Congress and the mainstream media have gone after TikTok, because TikTok is not controlled by corporate entities that skew its reporting. It offers people an opportunity to report directly with no filter. And that means that it reports atrocities by Israel. The social media have done so. There is, I should say, in addition to the effort by Al Jazeera, there is a devastating film by The Gray Zone, which directly addresses and describes the misbehavior of the media, the hypocrisy of the media, the double standards the media has applied, and the subservience of the media to the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which directs its Hasbara, or Hasbara is explanation in Hebrew, I gather. It means propaganda. And finally, there is a brilliant film by the Turkish aid agency. I think it's called something like Where Were You?, which imagines a visit by a parent and child to museums of the Gaza Holocaust in 2040. That is 15, 16 years from now, with the child looking at the horrors on display and asking his or her parent, where were you? What did you do? Why could you do nothing? How could you do nothing? This is exactly the question that arose from the Holocaust in Europe. If you don't act, who will? If you just talk and do nothing, what does that mean? And so I think people, in fact, are beginning, some portions of the media, not the mainstream media in the West, are beginning to counterattack the propaganda barrage, which has concealed from most viewers and readers what has actually happened. The New York Times, which is notoriously biased on the issue of Zionism, has actually begun to report more honestly. Not very, but more honestly.
Yeah. Here is a video in which a Singaporean scholar, Kishore Mahbubani, is talking about the way that the mainstream media works in the United States.
really
Kishore is a friend of
surprised
mine.
me is that on the one hand, the United States has clearly the freest media in the world, the best finance newspapers, the best finance television stations in the world. But I can tell you this, as someone who travels to at least 30, 40 countries a year, when I come to the United States and I go to my hotel room in Charles Hotel and turn on the television, I feel that I've been cut off from the rest of the world. And literally, the insularity of the American discourse is actually frightening. I've said this to my friends there anyway in New York Times. This is true of the New York Times, this is true of the Washington Post, this is true of the Wall Street Journal. There is an incestuous, self-referential discourse among these newspaper journalists and so on and so forth. And they reinforce each other's perspectives and end up misunderstanding the world. Because the one key point I emphasize is that the era of Western domination of world history was a 200-year aberration. It's coming to an end. And as a result of it, you've got to learn to understand non-Western perspectives in the world. And it's actually quite frightening that in many ways, I find American intellectuals behind intellectuals, including in Serbia, where I just was, or Greece, or in Istanbul, because they are much more aware of what's happening in the world than most American intellectuals are. I don't know how to solve that problem.
Kishore Mahbubani is entirely correct about everything except it wasn't 200 years of Western dominance, it was 500. Began with the opening of the Americas to Europe and Vasco da Gama's invasion of the Indian Ocean, followed by the building of European empires that covered the world. But he's absolutely correct. The number of American foreign correspondents is now around 100. It was 2,700 after World War II. So this is an enormous shrinkage. The corporate media treat the news as entertainment and as a vehicle for advertising sales, not as they once did, as something that serves the public interest. This changed, I don't know exactly, probably in the 1970s. The Federal Communications Commission, which had demanded that media treat the news as a public service, stopped doing that and started treating it as a cost center for business purposes. So it had to entertain, it had to attract attention, and people just don't want to hear bad news. Although the press likes to convey certain kinds of bad news, it does not want to then. People do not want to have their prejudices challenged. Social media has reinforced this because you get into little groups of people of like mind. But the fact is, Kishore Mahbubani, who's a friend of mine, is entirely correct about this, and it basically leaves the United States without situational awareness. We do not know what is going on around us. We have a version of it that is predigested and spat out by corporate media, not for the purposes of educating the public, but for the purposes of selling advertising.
I remember that I talked with Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He said in the final days of the conflict in Ukraine, when this conflict was, the Russians decided to go into Ukraine and everything was there to start a new war. He talked with Jake Sullivan and said that you can make peace, you can talk with Russians. He said, don't worry, Jeffrey. I think the Russians are so weak, they're not going to do anything.
Yes, well, this is an example of the sorts of dangers that flow from inaccurate information. a surprise, which that was, is what happens when an entrenched policy position denies reality. You get reports, intelligence reports, which say this, and this is true, and the policymakers say, "Oh, it can't be true. It doesn't sound like what I know. Must be wrong," and they ignore it. That was how 9/11 happened. That is how Israel has been surprised, not just on October 7th. And by the way, October 7th, horrible as it was, I mean, there were many atrocities, not, I think, mainly by the Hamas fighters, but by people who came out of the concentration camp of Gaza with them and were totally undisciplined, looted, pillaged, and maybe even raped, although there's no proof of that. That single set of atrocities doesn't begin to match the long record of Israeli atrocities of a similar nature against Palestinians. I mentioned a few of them earlier. There's quite a record. And we used to condemn this. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson, who was anxious about his election, having come into the presidency after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and was running against Barry Goldwater and didn't know that he would necessarily win, had a meeting in Long Island with a group of wealthy Jewish donors, and he agreed to do two things. First, take Israel off the terrorism list, because they were considered terrorists by us at that time. And second, lift the arms embargo on Israel. We had an embargo on arms to Israel. The chart that you put up from the Watson Institute will show that there were virtually no arms sales to Israel until after 1964. Now, that was what happened. And therefore, you cannot understand US policy in West Asia except by reference to American domestic political expediency. And we're in a campaign now. So that complicates everything. Mr. Biden does not want to leave office appearing to be indifferent to the defense of Israel. Of course, as I said, Israel is not defending itself. It's conducting a campaign of extermination, ethnic cleansing, mass murder, and assassination. And it is not responding to threats, it is creating them. So I think to go to your point about Russia and Iran being pushed together, they have a reason to be pushed together because the United States is making no effort to separate them, doing quite the contrary. And the same is true of China and Russia, which we have pushed together. So this is unwise. Whoever is elected president is going to inherit a mess.
Yeah. In terms of the conflict in Ukraine, how do you see the policy of Washington right now? Are we seeing some sort of division within the administration?
I believe that the Defense Department and the intelligence community understand that Ukraine has lost the war, and that talk of victory and victory plans are unrealistic. I don't know. I think Mr. Biden himself may have come to this conclusion. And while he did not go to Ramstein, the air base in Germany at Frankfurt, to meet with Zelensky and other supporters of Zelensky, as he had planned, because I think of the multiple hurricanes that Florida is experiencing. I believe he also probably found it easier not to go, because this is a cause that is obviously not going to succeed. And now we hear, that there is hope by some that if Mr. Trump is elected, he will wash his hands of Ukraine. Who said that? The Speaker of the House, Mr. Johnson, said, if Trump is elected, this war will end. Therefore, I don't see any need to provide more assistance to Ukraine because the war will end. That's what he said just the other day. If Kamala Harris is elected, it is also not clear that the war will continue because more and more people have understood that what its main result has been to cost Ukraine territory, to embarrass NATO on the battlefield, and to put us right back where we started, with Ukraine having to accept neutrality again, as it was neutral when it was created as an independent state. It will have to return to that. It will not be able to join NATO, despite a lot of wishful thinking about, for example, the German model, West Germany versus East Germany. That's not going to happen. And it will have to restore the rights of its minority peoples, the Russian speakers, the Hungarian speakers, the Romanian speakers, the other minorities in Ukraine, which has many minorities. And there will have to be a broader discussion of European security architecture. All of this could have happened, as Jeffrey Sachs apparently advised Mr. Sullivan back in 2021, 2022, could have happened with no bloodshed. Instead, there are well over 1 million people dead. Ukraine has been gutted, its infrastructure destroyed, its industry ruined, its exports of grain obstructed, and 11 or 12 million of its people emigrated to other countries. So this is an entirely pointless and disastrous decision that the Biden administration made, apparently on the basis of entirely incorrect understanding of the correlation of forces in Eastern Europe and the determination of the Russians not to have an American military presence on their border.
To wrap up this session, Ambassador, do you think right now the European Union, we've learned recently that they're trying in the United Kingdom, in Germany, they're trying to train Ukrainian soldiers. But at the end of the day, they know whoever wins in the United States, the situation in Ukraine going to be much more complicated than it is right now.
Ukraine will have whatever remains of Ukraine, and it will not be the Ukraine of 2021. Whatever remains of Ukraine, probably minus the Donbass region and the other areas that Russia has annexed, or at least most parts of those oblasts, maybe other parts of Ukraine, like Odessa, also gone. What remains of Ukraine will have a right to defend itself and should have the means to do so, not as a member of NATO, but as an armed neutral like Austria or like Finland before it joined NATO, or like Sweden before it joined NATO. The best guarantee of Ukrainian freedoms would be a democratic, prosperous Ukraine associated with the European Union, but not in NATO, and therefore not a threat to its neighbor, its huge neighbor, Russia. That may yet happen. But speaking of the European Union, we have every reason to believe what Radoslav Sikorsky said to two Russian pranksters who pretended to be African journalists, I believe. Namely, Ukraine is not fit to join the European Union and won't be for at least a decade, at the most optimistic. It is not a democracy now. It doesn't have a free press. It does not treat its minorities fairly. It does not have an economy that is where corruption is limited. It is rampant. And it is not qualified to join the European Union. So I know people in Eastern Europe are sometimes capable of magic tricks. For example, I have experienced myself that if you go into a rotating doorway, into a building, and a Hungarian guy steps in behind you, he will come out first somehow. And maybe Ukrainians and Poles are capable of the same thing. But short of a magic trick, Ukraine is going to have to negotiate on worse terms than it would have been able to get in 2021 or 2022. And that is very sad. And it is tragic, in fact, because of all the deaths that accompanied this deterioration in Ukraine's position. But it's a fact.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
I don't know about the pleasure, but I was glad to be with you, Nima.
It's a
Keep
pleasure.
up the good work.
Thank you. Bye-bye.